Welcome back. We are now on step 3 of how to prepare a TAP. We have already gone through step 1, which was to set the ambition for the technology action plans, step 2, which was to identify the actions and activities, and now we are on step 3, which is focusing on how do we identify stakeholders and determine the timelines for actions and activities. Now, in this particular presentation, we are trying to cover 3 things. We are trying to look into how to identify stakeholders. We are trying to look into this issue of how do we ensure that stakeholders are fully engaged, and step 3, we are looking at scheduling and sequencing of activities. Now, identification of stakeholders for the implementation of the TAP is something which you can say we are already been engaging with the stakeholders throughout the TNA process. We have prepared the TNA reports, which was also through a stakeholder consultation process. We have been working on the barrier analysis and enabling framework report, which again is through a stakeholder consultation process, and these stakeholder consultation processes have typically happened through technology or sectoral work groups. Now, these sectoral work groups would be, you can say, a starting point for us in terms of identification of the stakeholders. But since we have in the previous step also identified actions and activities which we have to undertake within technology action plans, these actions and activities itself provide us another input for looking for stakeholders. And once we have identified the activities, we would like to also identify an institution which would be responsible or which would be provided a primary responsibility for implementation of the activity. And it is also a good practice that we should sometimes have another institution which would be having a secondary responsibility or a fallback institution which can come into place if the first institution for whatever reasons cannot participate in this. And institution and identification of institution is a very good thing, but we should also move down within the institutions to look into who are the responsible people within the respective institution. So, it is a good idea to identify a few people within the institution who would be acting as a focal point for this. Now, we have already identified the stakeholders and we have identified the key people. It is but very important that we also think of how we will engage the stakeholders. Engagement of the stakeholders is very important, and the best way of doing is that we do a good job ourselves. So, the first step in this is to map the stakeholders. So, mapping of the stakeholders in terms of their responsibilities and in terms of the power they exercise within the whole system is very important. Then, whenever we are organizing some kind of a stakeholder consultations, it is very important that these stakeholder consultations are properly planned and roles and responsibilities for all the stakeholders are clearly defined. Thirdly, we should also see that, because finally there are institutions and individuals involved in this process, we have to see how we can engage them and get their interest and ownership. So, we have to appeal to their interests and let them take the ownership of the whole process to ensure a successful stakeholder consultation process. There can be other reasons which we could appeal to, like acquisition of information or networking opportunities and so on. And there is a video, a full video on stakeholder consultation, video number 3 on the TNA project website, which you can go through if you want to get familiar with other ways of engaging with the stakeholders. Now, once we have identified the individuals and institutions, we have the activities in place, the next step is to prepare a work plan so that we can define when different activities are going to happen and when they are basically going to start and when they are going to end. And the best way of going about this is to first of all look at all the activities we have in front of us, and we try to see what is the sequence of the activities. By that we mean that we try to see which activity has a predecessor in some other activity? Does a particular activity require that a particular activity should be preceding it or following it? So, establishing a sequence is very important. Secondly, we should also look into the nature of activities. By nature of activities, I mean that what is the scale of the activities, how much resources does the activity require. This is very important to understand. Then the last 2 points are more related to the strategy of implementation of the TAP. So, is the country planning to implement the TAP on a national scale, in a very top down fashion, or is the country trying to divide this whole implementation on a very regional basis and trying to do it on a regional basis? Then we need to have a different kind of an approach. Or are we trying to implement the whole of the technology action plan in one go, or are we trying to implement the TAP in some small steps, or dividing the whole TAP into some small projects and programs? So, based on that strategy, the activities, the resources and the duration will get affected. Now, we are again at the end of step 3. So far we have covered step 1, which is on setting the ambition, step 2, which is to define the actions and activities, and step 3 we have covered is with respect to defining the stakeholders and preparing a work plan for the same. The next step would be more on funding and sources of funding. Thank you very much.